household, whether it's actually true or not, is a case-by-case thing, but as by Confucianism, nobody really, even reads these books anymore. However, the daily life of any Japanese structure is Confucianism. You won't find, say, women as the head of companies or even executive members of the companies, or very few vice presidents. This is because Confucianism is basically a feudalistic male-dominated society structure. And that continues, although that is eroding very quickly in Japan. I wouldn't say very quickly, but gradually, noticeably within the last 20 years. It is also still a very strong influence, even more so in Korea. And that is basically a feudalistic, has its origins even before feudalism, but a sort of feudalistic mindset. And a lot of the dedication that the Japanese feel to their individual family members, or their own company, or any organization they're involved in, this structure is basically Confucian. So, but again, in Japan, nobody claims to be a Confucius. And on another level, and how it affects Asia in general is ancestor worship. Now, even Buddhism, and many of my duties, or many of the duties of any Buddhist priest in this country, are related around ancestor worship. An ancestor dies, well, in the States, you have your funeral, and that's basically it. But in Japan, there are many memorial services that go on and on and on for as long as 33 years after the person has died. And that is basically an ancestor worship. For example, even though it's a Confucian concept, typical priest in any Buddhist sect, at least half of his duties involve going around from house to house, doing about a 15-minute ceremony, usually chanting in front of the family altar, saying prayers for the deceased relatives. Now, these folks are honored, and they have their spirit. The spirit comes back to the altar or to the family site. And also this, for example, and maybe you've seen on television the Obon festival in August in Kyoto, where they have the fires up in the mountainside with certain Chinese characters. These spirits come back and visit Japan or that area, and these fires are lit up to guide the spirits back. The next one is Shintoism. I'm glad to hear from some of you that you had a fellow speaking about Shintoism already. Probably managed to confuse you. Shintoism of all these is the most difficult to understand. I've been in Japan about 12 years now. I've read many books about Shintoism. I've had a chance on more than one occasion to speak to Shinto priests, and to this day I barely know what Shintoism is. Very hard to define, and that's partly because it is not very well defined even among themselves. And I've asked Shinto priests to just simply define this religion for me, please, and in some cases they've just said they cannot. Partly it's a very nebulous religion, if we can call it a religion. And one of the difficulties I think we may be having in understanding these, as we understand religion in the West, which is basically Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, dogma is very important. Now, dogma is not merely belief. It is not merely an opinion. Dogma is generally a doctrine or body of doctrines formally and authoritatively affirmed. That's according to Webster's. So you've got a religious body that is authoritatively affirming a certain set of beliefs. Well, we can understand that in Christianity we have that, or in Judaism, or in Islam. But in any of these religions here, except for Christianity, but even Japanese Christianity is a very light version. There is no single body that pushes dogma. of course, in, say, folk religions, there is no official body at all that remains. There probably never was, except for ancient shaman that existed before, basically before civilization developed. Taoism never really had, except for maybe the founders way back in China who wrote the most famous books, which are basically almost just poetry books, actually, nature worship. Hardly anything dogmatic about that. And Confucianism, well, Confucius wrote several books on social structures and things like that, but there is no body that affirms any kind of dogma, and there really is no dogma. What Confucius did was he developed a pattern, a social structure for a model for people to follow if they wanted to. That is what Confucius designed. Shintoism, they really, I can say they almost have no dogma. It is, has been nicknamed the religion of 10,000 gods, very animistic religion. Gods, in this sense, is synonymous with spirits. Now what that means is that you've got mountain gods, you've got gods for any animate object, particularly trees older trees, objects that have been around for a while, obviously in the mountains. They seem to acquire a spirit over time. This is why an older tree has a spirit. Now, in my particular case, I found that out more when I began pruning trees in my own temple. Some of the neighbors were a little bit upset, and they told me that bad things would happen to me. But I told them I wasn't afraid. And no, I did some serious pruning of some trees that were very, very old, and that upset some of the extended neighbors, not the immediate neighbors, because the immediate neighbors were raking the leaves almost as much as I was, and they were in danger of having their houses crushed by falling limbs, as I was. This is why I more than pruned some of these trees, shall I say. But this upset a lot of the neighbors, extended neighbors, not the neighbors that were sweeping the leaves every day. And that's because people believe that these trees acquire a spirit, and they were afraid that I might kill some of the trees, and so on. And even the act of pruning these trees was perhaps incurring the wrath of the spirit of these trees. Of course, none of us here believe that, but the Japanese do. That is a Shinto, basically a Shinto concept. And also for wells. I mean, if you fill a well, particularly if the well has been there for a while, nobody is going to fill a well nowadays, because they're afraid the spirit of the well will come back and haunt you or do evil things to you. And recently, about 2 weeks ago, we had some earthquakes, again getting back to the spirit of trees. And there was a very large tree in a temple that went down not far from my temple, and went down on a house. And they brought in 3 cranes to move it, and there were 6 people working on that tree. The tree was probably 300-400 years old, and had been in danger of falling down for some time. I mean, it was at quite a slant. But of course, nobody could take any action to prevent this tree from crashing into the house. Of course, the house owners were wanting to prune the tree back for some time, but they had to get a permission or approval from everybody in the neighborhood. And of course, nobody would give approval, and nobody wanted to do it except the person whose house was in danger. And of course, the typhoon came along, and down the tree came. So they had all these people in. You know, it couldn't be helped. They had to move the tree. And interestingly enough, during this process, a large snake appeared. It scared the life out of everybody. So of course, what they had to do was bring in the local Shinto priest as soon as possible. In fact, all work stopped from that moment on, and he did his purification ceremony, and then work proceeded. And none of these people would say, I am a Shinto believer, or I believe in Shinto. However, there you've got the a modern day application. In fact, any building that goes up in Japan, even this building, before it was built, had its own Shinto